see the email I sent? Because I don't want to be too redundant. If you saw, there's just a lot of kind of almost housekeeping with that. If you wonder how to submit things that you've written, you know, that's there. The link to the Iowa Poetry Association, links to YouTube links that are up so far from this series. The Zoom link that you can pop back on if you lose one. Though I'll keep sending that out every week because I just think it's
which I didn't understand.
Let's see. On there, I try to get specific with what the schedule is, so presenters, you could kind of see what's happening the next couple 3 weeks. And one thing I do want to mention to this group too is if you have any suggestions, or you yourself would like to try your hand at doing a presentation through this forum, I want to make sure that there is space for you, and that you know we're receptive to that. You know, you finding a tie-in that inspires you, art, history, culture of the area and or Grant Wood, maybe a specific painting or a series of paintings or artworks of his has captured your imagination, a certain aspect of his life you'd like to go deeper into, the culture of the era of that era, that an area that we haven't quite touched on as much. Receptive and open to that in terms of planning in the future. So don't be shy. We're, you know, we do a lot. We have space for everything from some heavy scholarship to lightheartedness. So, and kind of easy breezy ways to engage the life and times. So tonight, I think we're just about done. I always want to give a shout out to the Cedar Rapids Public Library officially as our most awesome and enduring partner in doing this, making this available to us on an ongoing basis. They're fabulous to work with. Everyone I've ever worked with the library, it's just really wonderful. And they're opening this door for us and keeping it open. And that really is, it's turning out to be quite a meaningful thing. So very grateful. We'll have the presentation with, this time we'll start out with the presentation with Barbara and Sylvia. And then after that, they're done with the Q&A and everything, we'll pop in and Dawn will be regaling us with her findings of the times that tie in. And we can, so those of you who enjoy the poetry can linger with that. If some of you that you know you're not going to write poetry, but you know, feel free. We want this forum to be whatever you can take out of it and enjoy. Well aware that not everybody's a writer, well aware that not everybody's going to be into every aspect of everything we do, but we sure tried to do a lot of different things and hit a lot of high points. So I'm so glad you're all here to share time. And without further ado, let's turn it over. I'm going to mute and turn it over to Barb and Sylvia.
Okay, well, what you missed was that I said happy birthday to Grant Wood, but also I wanted to thank Barb Feller for her marvelous sharing of her time and talents to help put this program together. When Elaine first proposed this idea to me, I thought it might be a great time for me to roll around in some of my childhood memories and then try to align them with actual history. I was born in Cedar Rapids, but spent my early childhood in Ottumwa, surrounded by extended family, happy as a clam. And when my parents returned to Cedar Rapids in the middle of my 4th grade year, I was quite sad. However, it did not take me long to begin to enjoy all of the wonderful opportunities that living in an economically thriving medium-sized community offered. During junior high and high school years, I enjoyed constant trips to the library, concerts at Coe College, live theater, and visits to and Lord have mercy, an actual art association. I'll just skip on to the next part. Since many of us grew up with scant exposure to the significance of how the efforts of women shaped our lives and communities, some of this information may come as a surprise. Others of you may be steeped in this knowledge, but bear with me. Often our perceptions are shaped by what we experience as children. My own grandmothers were, as far as I know, simply focused on family survival. In this photo, you will see a picture of my maternal grandmother on the right hand of the screen, wearing a stylish dress and a smart looking hat. This photo is one that I just came across in the last couple of months, and it was such a shock to me because all of the photos that I have seen of my grandmother, she is looking like an exhausted, depleted woman. She bore 7 children, 4 of them before women had achieved the right to vote. Her life, okay, her life in Southwest Iowa, in Wayne County to be specific, was rather isolated, as you can see from the photo in the upper left-hand corner. Wayne County, in the rural Wayne County, was a place where childbearing depleted women's bodies and the depression depleted families' financial resources. When my not yet. Oh.
I'm glad you gave me such credit. Knowing what I'm doing. All right, go ahead.
Okay, when my grandfather lost the farm, as my mother referred to it, her family moved many times, and they moved within many small towns. But there was a silver lining, and that was that there were better schools, better public libraries, and better resources for developing young minds. The lower picture here shows my mother and her sister graduating, and Nancy Mortimer, if you're on here, this is at Sheraton High School. I think this was actually when they were in junior college, which was housed in the high school building.
Yes, it was. What year was that?
This would, gosh, technical questions. I'll have to go back and look for sure. But
Okay.
they're in sort of in the center. There's a woman with a neck brace, and my Aunt Ellen and my mother are right beside her. My grandmother, however, went on to raise all 7 children, 6 of whom achieved undergraduate degrees, and 3 of them achieved advanced degrees. They took music lessons, they were voracious readers, and they also did lots of nature study. Many of these pleasures were not available to the women whose daily lives were just the tedious chores of keeping body and soul together. I do have a cute story, though, about how my grandmother left her children at home and walked to see a Chautauqua. And I believe the Chautauqua would have been in Leon, Iowa. And the children say they followed her and hid in the ditch so they could see what was going on too. When I look at so many of Grant Wood's paintings, I see the faces of my ancestors, and you can see in Victorian survival that there is something about that. And these connections are not always comfortable, but clearly Grant Wood saw my people in those moments. One of the reasons I put this picture in is because it shows a piece of art done by Edwin Bruns, who is the gentleman sitting at the far left-hand side of the screen talking to Sutherland Dowse. He was commissioned to do a series of 8 paintings, of 7 paintings, the 7 stages of a city. And this one of the native village may not be completely accurate, but most of the ones that he did were quite beautiful. And he was a wonderful regionalist painter and a good friend of Grant Wood's. He also created a beautiful mural for the Western Bohemian Insurance Association, which was just revealed a few years ago when that building was possibly going to be torn down. And it was removed by of the very careful hands of some Cedar Rapidians who belong to a group called Save Cedar Rapids Heritage. And now it is in the Cherry Building and on the second floor. And so if you ever wanted to go and see this marvelous mural that Edward Bruns created, you can do that. And it's open to the public when the Cherry Building is open. Edward Bruns was also the supervisor for the Cedar Rapids Community Schools. And he was a great teacher of art in his spare time and worked through the YMCA, and his classes were always full. Yeah, that's okay. We can go on. And now we know the names of many families that came to Cedar Rapids, but Barbara and I thought we should introduce everyone to Prudence Crane Higley, in case you haven't met her. She and her husband, Abel, came to the area of Cedar Rapids in 1842. 5 months after they arrived, Abel died, leaving her with 6 children from ages 4 to 22. She was left also with a small allowance, but she was a woman with a keen mind and an eye to the future. And she was able to purchase land in downtown Cedar Rapids, eventually erecting buildings, one of which, the Granby Building, was named for her home of, okay, he's coming again, was named for her hometown of West Granby, Connecticut. I apologize. I'm so sorry that I keep cutting in and out. It's just a challenge. Okay.
We thought that maybe this really shouldn't have done it.
Yes, but we wanted to make sure we knew of her because she was one of, actually, although she wasn't exactly considered a captain of industry, she certainly built wealth for her family and made many contributions to the community of Cedar Rapids. She also was clever enough to purchase large tracts of land, most notably 160 acres between 14th and 19th Streets from Beaver Avenue to Mount Vernon Road Southeast. And while our history books are filled with stories of the captains of industry, this was the first that Barbara and I had heard of Prudence Crane Higley. All right, next, yeah. This is a sketch of a structure that was referred to as Little Muddy. It was the actual beginning of First Presbyterian Church. While the land of the natives was often stolen in a way by land developers plying the natives with alcohol, alcoholism was a problem for many of the white settlers. And Little Muddy, though a primitive structure, was the place of a first ladies' society meeting in 1852. 27 ladies met at First Presbyterian, Little Muddy was First Presbyterian Church, and they found their voice to lobby the state legislature to prohibit alcoholic beverages. Even though women did not have the right to vote in political elections at that time, they did get together and bring pressure upon legislative bodies. In the 1850s, there were more than 1,000 temperance organizations across the United States. While the temperance movement is often thought of as one of legalistic religious fervor, in truth, it was a desperate attempt to mitigate the disastrous effects of widespread alcoholism. One historian has written of America that it could have been called an alcoholic republic. Liquor was so popular that the army dared not bar the recruitment and re-enlistment of habitual drunkards. These vast quantities of alcohol were consumed primarily by men, leading to abuse, illness, and death. While that group of 27 in Cedar Rapids preceded the official establishment of the WCTU nationally, These ladies knew firsthand there was a terrible problem and knew something had to be done. While Carrie Nation, often the face of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the press, preferred spectacle to lobbying, the other women organized for advocacy. The National WTCU, founded in 1874, grew to become one of the largest and most influential women's groups of the 19th century. The national organization was quickly followed by an international organization, which was founded in 1876. As it grew, the WTCU expanded its platform to campaign for labor laws, prison reform, and suffrage. While the organization itself began to decline after the passage of the 18th Amendment, which brought prohibition to the entire company, internal disagreements about the organization's purpose and disagreement and direction hampered its viability. On the right or on the left-hand side of the screen, you see a picture of the WTCU of Iowa in Washington, Iowa, and this would have been in 1957. This is a picture taken by Joan Liffring-Zug Boucher, and I think I must give credit to her. She is one of my heroes. Her pictures of Iowa and Iowa women, and indeed her efforts for civil rights, always have impressed and motivated me to be involved on another level. Okay, okay, let's go to John Ely. John, can you hear me? John M. Ely, in his recollections too, as told to Roby Kessler, mentioned that by law, there could only be one saloon for every 1,000 people. And I'm quoting him here. Women were not allowed inside the saloons. My grandfather's shaver was often called on by women to go and get their husbands who were in the saloons. I mean, prominent families here in Cedar Rapids, and I won't mention any names, but it seemed that every prominent family had someone addicted to alcohol. I think they called on my grandfather Schaefer because his oldest son, John, was addicted, and they knew my grandfather understood. He was born in John M. Ely was born in 1884, and his extended family was significant in the development of Cedar Rapids. He grew up surrounded by very strong women who owned property and were well educated and committed to the development of Cedar Rapids. About the same time that temperance unions were trying to bring sobriety to the masses, various missionary groups were being formed. Many of these societies were formed to bring direct practical relief to local families in need at a time when there were no social agencies. Many denominations supported missionary societies, and from my reading, it seems that these societies were most directly concerned with providing for the needs of families rather than saving souls. Oddly, there was not universal support, though, for this benevolent work. Several pastors voiced opinions that these women were too forward, unladylike, should remember that their place was in the home, too strong-minded, and should not be recognized. Since his negativity appeared as women were creating a state society for missions, one cannot help wondering if these pastors were truly opposed to the mission or worried about the collective power of organized women. While the missionary societies were some of the first groups organized by women, they were closely followed by groups of literary societies. One of the first of these in Cedar Rapids was the Ladies Literary Society, founded in 1879 by Mrs. E.R. Burkhalter and by Mary Ware Ely. In the book, The Story of Cedar Rapids by Jeanette Stevenson Murray and Frederick Gray, published in 1950 and so kindly lent to me by Barbara Feller, there is a chapter entitled Cedar Rapids Women and Hundreds of Clubs. The chapter does indeed catalog the plethora of women's clubs and societies. 73 years after the publication of the Murray's book, many of these clubs are still active and vital. I'm not completely sure if the Ladies Literary Society and the Ladies Literary Club are one and the same, but the 1879 date suggests they might be. Some of the other clubs formed in the 1880s are the Tourist Club, the Athena Club, the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle, the Wednesday Shakespeare Club, the Monday Shakespeare Club, the Marian Shakespeare Club, and the Cultus Club, the Tuesday Study Club, the Hesperian, the Minerva, Delphian, and the Cedar Rapids Women's Club. Through the 1890s and into the 1900s, Women's Club offered much needed opportunities for women to gather, socialize, experience intellectual stimulation and self-improvement. But it did not take long before their purpose grew to include philanthropic, political, and direct action. I should also mention Cedar Rapids had several clubs and organizations devoted to music. Beethoven Club, founded in 1921, is still going strong. And if you want a lovely morning of music and some history, check their schedule and attend one of their meetings and performances. Excuse me, I need a drink here. Am I coming through my voice anyway?
Much better. Keep
Thank
speaking
you.
straight ahead.
Okay. As Iowa grew, so did the power wielded by these early women's groups to influence legislation and community advancement, even before they could vote. As Karen Mason writes in the Annals of Iowa, club work was a fact of life for many Iowa women in the last decade of the 19th century. The number of women who belonged to organized clubs in this period is astounding. The Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs, organized in 1893, had 35 clubs as charter members. That same year, the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs affiliated with the General Federation of Women's Clubs, founded 3 years prior in 1890. The number of affiliated clubs in Iowa grew rapidly, reaching 284 by 1903 and 931 by its peak in 1933. By that time, the Iowa branch of the International League for Peace and Freedom represented more than 40,000 women. Iowa women, it was not unusual, the degree of organization of its women, although it did earn the distinction of being the first state organization admitted to the General Federation of Women's Clubs. By the turn of the 20th century, an estimated 2 million American women were members of women's clubs and organizations. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, suffrage organizations dissolved or were transformed into new organizations, such as the League of Women Voters. Okay, do you want to go back to the DAR, because I seem to have lost that page. Okay. Other women's clubs which formed around a specific ideology, such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, have been challenged to maintain relevancy as researchers delve deeper into history. Cedar Rapids was the home to 2 DAR chapters, the Ashley chapter, which was founded in 1898. And this is a picture, this newspaper picture shows members of the Ashley chapter of the DAR. And then the Mayflower chapter, which was founded in 1935. Together, they boasted a membership of 210 by 1950. Iowa's DAR competed with Ohio's to the claim to be the largest state branch of that organization in the Midwest after 1904. The DAR, one of the most conservative of the women's clubs in the progressive era, did actually offer women some of the same social interaction and intellectual stimulation as did the study clubs of the General Federation. It especially appeared to women who were interested in history and genealogy. The historical projects they undertook gave them a feeling of contributing something to their community. The vitality of the DAR in Iowa in the early 20th century was due in large part to its willingness to adapt its historical agenda to include a focus on local history. Prior to the onset of World War I, Iowa's DAR undertook projects that included lobbying for child labor laws and additional social welfare legislation. But by the 1920s, the DAR had turned its focus to Americanism and anti-communism, engaging in nativism and red baiting. This led to conflict with other women's organizations, a clear indication that women were not a cohesive interest-sharing bloc, but also it caused conflict within communities. And Barbara will deal with that more next week, but if, can we go back one more there? To the, there, all right. The woman in the center here, looking much, much younger and much more fashionable than the other ladies, is Mrs. Worth Averill. And Steve Hankin shared information with me that she had a strong connection to Grant Wood, and she was, I believe you said, a sister to Sarah Maxwell Sherman, Grant Wood's wife of a short time. But her husband, the Averills, were fabulously wealthy, some of the wealthiest people in Cedar Rapids. An interesting thing is that in the Grant Wood collection at Washington High School, there is a picture of this, of Mrs. Worth Averill, and it was taken by the Van Vechten photographer, Carl Van Vechten, and it's part of the information says that she and her husband were the last people to visit Grant Wood as he was dying in Iowa City, so possibly the last people to see him alive and talk with him. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So many of the groups that got together to talk about literary concepts were also very interested in Shakespeare. In fact, many of the clubs across America that were formed, there were, during this period, there were 500 Shakespeare clubs across the United States. And in Iowa, there were 20. And the picture that we're looking at right now is a picture of the Shakespearean Club from Osage, Iowa, which has been the subject of many different studies because of its uniqueness. In the late 19th century, the women's club movement began gaining steam, particularly as an intellectual outlet for middle-class women who were denied the opportunity to express themselves in the presence of their husbands. The Shakespearean Club of Osage, Iowa, was formed in 1881. It originally included both men and women, but by 1890, the men had dropped out. By 1900, club discussions were accompanied by action outside of the meetings. Club members worked to establish playgrounds and libraries. They developed anti-smoking and anti-spitting campaigns. They wrote to state senators and representatives to express their support of widows and teachers' pensions, inspection of working conditions in factories, and women's suffrage. Their membership also included one Jewish member whose family was an integral part of the Osage community, and she indeed was an integral part of this Shakespeare Club. Most Shakespeare clubs had limited membership and strict rules and high expectations. The one with which I am personally acquainted is the Wednesday Shakespeare Club in Cedar Rapids. Now we're looking at a picture of the Marion Shakespeare Club, which also has been the study or the subject of studies in the women's archives, both at Iowa and nationally. But Wednesday Shakespeare Club, and the center here, you see the club in 1906, was formed by young women who convinced a very well-trained Shakespearean, I guess I would say a Shakespearean scholar named Mrs. H.L. Saylor. And she led the club for 31 years and brought great intellectual stimulation to the women who were in this club. Now, I don't know if this club was particularly political prior to the times when I have gone into the archives to study, which was 1926 and 1927 forward. In the late 20s, the club decided that they would give to the Cedar Rapids community a Shakespearean garden in Ellis Park. And they did great studies of what it would take. They sort of rounded up the troops. They did fundraising. They convinced people that this would be a wonderful gift to the community. And in 1931, and if you just want to go back for 1 minute, in 1931, they presented to the community of Cedar Rapids its first piece of public sculpture, which was a bust of William Shakespeare. And that was quite an event. They also, okay, let's see, Shakespeare, and go back one more minute, go back. And they also, in this picture, you will possibly see some things that look a little bit like tree trunks. They hired Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn to design the first entrance, which was an example of a thatched roof cottage like Anne Hathaway's, which of course did not survive for long in Iowa climate. But they were enthusiastic and dedicated to their purpose. Okay, and also we can go to the next slide. Also, we see this beautiful bust and the marble pedestal in 1931. And whatever the next. And here we are, a recent photograph of the Shakespeare Club, and you'll notice Barb Feller, and you may know Patty Powers, Ruth Ann Herbert, Pat Martin, and there's Nancy Mortimer in a blue top and a straw hat, and on sitting down in front of the dedication is me in a green dress and much longer hair and many fewer wrinkles. So there may be 3 Shakespeare clubs still active in Iowa, one in Burlington, and that Burlington the Burlington Club also maintains a Shakespeare Garden in Burlington and has a Facebook page, which I think is quite brave. There also may still be one in Ottumwa. There in 2017, there was a Shakespeare Club of Lake City, but that's the last bit of information I can find out about it, and it was primarily for social time. We should also recognize that the fact that many of the women's clubs of those days formed in the period reflected the racism of the society at that time. Since women of color were not welcome into the white women's clubs and organizations, in 1902, the Iowa Federation of Colored Women's Clubs was founded and became affiliated with the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. These clubs confronted many of the same issues as the white women's clubs, such as suffrage, prohibition, political corruption, but also had to combat the widespread negative racist stereotypes that were directed at them. They also worked on anti-lynching campaigns and ending prison chain gangs. 2 clubs mentioned in the story of Cedar Rapids are the Criterion Club and the George Washington Carver Club. With the abundance of literary and study groups in Cedar Rapids during the late 19th century, it seems odd to me that there was general apathy toward creating a public library. Private libraries had been opened in the 1870s, but were forced to discontinue due to the lack of funds. Since the population of Cedar Rapids doubled between 1880 and 1890, it was clear to some members of the community that in order to have a well-informed literate citizenry, access to books must be increased without requiring individuals to pay directly. My father always reminded me that there is no such thing as a free lunch, but without spreading the costs through the use of tax monies, it would not have been possible for kids like me to enjoy a constant life of reading. And many of the other citizens of Cedar Rapids were in that same situation. The driving force behind the establishment of a free public library was the intrepid Ava Amanda Fitch Van Vechten. president of the City Federation of Ladies Literary Clubs, organized in 1895. She insisted that one of the objectives of this new federation should be the establishment of a free public library. Due to her spirit and enthusiasm, the city council agreed to put the matter to a vote. While women could not vote generally in 1894, Iowa became one of only 2 states to pass legislation allowing women to vote on limited tax issues, including library levies. Ada marshaled her troops, so to speak, and the measure passed by only 59 votes, thanks to the women who voted in every ward of the city. The original public library was just a small room in the Granby building. Remember Prudence? We have to thank her. But it was a game changer. The first librarian was the sultry and beautiful Virginia Dodge, very well educated, but still quite a showstopper. She prophetically stated in the 1898 annual report that the library could not buy enough books to keep the children supplied with good literature. Cedar Rapidians flocked enthusiastically to the library, and thus the need for an ever-expanded collection and the need for more space. In reading the history of the library, I am convinced that the creative approaches to serving the needs of this community throughout the past 126 years are some of the most impressive and effective uses of time, talent, and monies to achieve an organization's mission. Ada would be proud. She lived to see the library at the corner of 3rd Avenue and 5th Street built and opened, but did not live long enough to witness just how integral a part of the life of Cedar Rapids the original Carnegie Library became, and its iterations since then still are. Okay. On the left-hand side of the screen is a copy of one of the certificates from the Palmer Method of Study. This was awarded to my husband's father in 1925, and he did have beautiful handwriting throughout his entire life. The reason I have it here is because Mrs. Palmer, Sadie, was an influential woman in the art world also, and she gave their house at, I believe it was 837 First Avenue, for use as the little gallery that was a big influence in the development of art in Cedar Rapids. At that time, the gentleman, Ed Rowan, was in charge, and when he went back to Washington, D.C. in 1934, I believe it was, the art from the Art Association that was in the little gallery was returned to the 2nd floor of the public library. Planning ahead, they had Ada Van Vechten and the people who were at that time on the board of the public library, remember we're talking early 1900s, designated a 2nd floor room that could be used by the Art Association. The Art Association was the dream of Professor Selton, Professor Selton, who was a professor of music at Coe College, but also dabbled in art. And his vision of the Art Association was formed. And even though he died in, let's see, excuse me, gotta look here for a minute. While he died in just a year after they began to work on developing an art association, his wife and many others in the communities pursued this vision. There were women's clubs. There was a club called the Club of 40, which we'll get to in just a minute. But also we have the slide of 5 Turner Alley, which was extremely significant in the development of not just art, but also art and theater in Cedar Rapids, and we all know the story of Grant Wood in that environment. Okay, the Club of 40, which were 40 people, primarily men, but some women, who promised for 5 years that they would give $50 a year to help get the Art Association off the ground. They also were responsible for buying oil paintings. There was also a watercolor club, which was primarily women who pledged $5 a year for 5 years, and they bought watercolors. And preceding that was an art club, which was founded by young women who had gone to the Chicago World's Fair, came home, and wanted passionately to study art. They were limited to 20 members, but they also planted the seeds for art enjoyment and acceptance within Cedar Rapids. So I think I'm going to stop, because I think that there will be other opportunities for people to talk about these different organizations. But I'm ending with this, one of my favorite paintings, which is the Tommy DePaolo painting, the takeoff on American Gothic, which I purchased in 1990 at the Museum of Art. And of course, we see Stregonona in the Gothic window in the back. We see Bambolona, and we see Big Anthony, who didn't pay attention. And that's how he's always described by Tommy. And I have this hanging in one of my favorite rooms, my lavender and grape bathroom. But this has been such an important part of my life growing up in Cedar Rapids that I always thought it just was there, that these wonderful advantages just somehow magically appeared. But following through and doing this research, and I have, well, those of you who know me know that I have a rabbit hole in my backyard in which I love to dive for study. I am just so impressed with the vision and determination of so many of our foremothers and forefathers who brought this kind of environment to a thriving industrial city so that we were able to achieve a balance. Thank you. I'm sorry that I'm not able to communicate better as far as hearing me, but one quick story. My friend Susan and I, when we were in high school, would go to downtown, because we could ride the bus and we'd visit Armstrong's, and then the library, but we also would go to the art center. And next door to the art center was a charming store called Yankee Studio. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Yankee Studio. And in those days, I was quite enchanted with the beautiful things that they had in Yankee Studio. And I saved my money, and I bought, as a junior in high school, I bought a set of beautiful white porcelain cups, which I later found out was a sake set, and that I needed to have a bottle of sake to really put it to good use. But all of those things that were available for us in Cedar Rapids, I think, shaped us in a very rich and enduring way. So I'll stop talking. And I have tons of research. If anybody is interested in the names of my books, I don't have a bibliography, but I can sure put one together. But it's great. So thanks a lot for listening.
Oh, Sylvia, thank
Yes.
you so much. And thanks for adding along the way some of the little comments about, the cultural backdrop that I could tell that you pulled some of that in, and that's so helpful to remind folks. The alcohol piece, it is, I think, easy to think that that was a rigid religion-based thing. But the more you read about it, the more you see how devastating
Mhm.
it was to
Well,
families and survival, you know?
and in those days, they hadn't recognized addiction as a disease or a condition that needed medical intervention. It was considered to be a moral failing, but at the same time, I can understand why the concept of not allowing it to be, to be in a community would give you a hope that if you had an addicted person in your family, hope that they would be able to avoid that. So, yeah, and the processes that we still face. And I wanted to say one thing, and I wasn't sure if I should say it, but I'm going to say it. Not all of the women's groups I studied had a positive vision. For instance, if you think of the Daughters of the Confederacy, how they changed, intentionally rewrote history, put in all those monuments, and tried to make the Civil War seem like a noble and righteous cause on the part of the South. I think we are still reeling from their influence. There's also a group right now of women, and you can kick me off of this forum if you wish, called, the clever name is Moms for Freedom. And their goal is to selectively remove from public schools and public libraries books that they find offensive. And I think they are a very dangerous group, and they have visited Iowa recently and are working very hard to get the legislature to pass legislation that will remove many important critical books from libraries. And it's just unfathomable to me that this is happening at this point in time. So it's not always good stuff, even if it's a women's group.
Yeah, we need scholarship, we need access to information. There's nothing that prevents a parent from saying, I don't want my child reading this book, even currently in the school systems.
Right.
Or I hear you're going to teach this book, I want an alternative for my child. But heavy-handed legislation is coming down the pike, and it's very stifling, it's very oppressive, it's very scary. I would agree, Olivia. So nope, sorry, not going to kick you off the forum.
Okay, thanks.
Sylvia?
Yeah.
Sylvia, hi, this is Steve.
Oh, hi, Steve. Could you finally hear me?
Oh, yes, and it was quite
Okay.
good. I was just in Tuskegee, Alabama. I gave a talk at the university there, historically black college. And to give you an example, even to this day, the Daughters of the Confederacy have a statue of Jefferson Davis in Tuskegee. Now, Tuskegee is 98% black. It's the home of George Washington Carver, and I mean, in terms of his university home, Booker T. Washington, the Tuskegee Airmen, and there in the town square is Jefferson Davis. Now, you might wonder, how could a town of 98% black people have a statue of Jefferson Davis? Well, it turns out the land in the public park where the statue is owned by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And, it didn't take me long when I got down to Alabama, which has some very nice things as well, but also had this side. You feel the Civil War to this day. Not only in Tuskegee, but I went to Montgomery. And within view of the church that Martin Luther King Jr. organized the bus boycott in the 50s for Rosa Parks, within the same eye angle view is the statue of Jefferson Davis, where he became president of the Confederate States. So to this day, you feel it very, very, very strongly. That was my comment.
Thank you.
Well, I bet some of you are familiar with the book Lies My Teacher Told Me. a scholar from the South, University of Mississippi or somewhere like that, really did some research to set the record straight on some things that were being put out in textbooks that didn't give proper context or are actually false. And a lot of us related to the Confederacy, Civil War, what was in the art, what was in the Articles of Confederation, the whole stuff about states' rights and all that. As so anyway, yeah, it's the arc of history bends towards progress, they say, but sometimes it zigzags backwards, it seems.
There's
Yeah,
there's Linda.
Well, the clubs and societies that you talk about in Cedar Rapids, those extended out into the rural areas too.
Yes.
Springville, as little as it is and was in those days, had 6 or 10 different literary societies, social societies, whatever, doing the same functions that you talk about, the ones in Cedar Rapids. So it stretched out into the rural environment too.
Yes, and I read about a group called the Daughters of Ceres, CERES, that was founded around Grimes, Iowa, and then there were other chapters that were founded in other counties. And it sounds like these women, well, to name their group after a Greek goddess, I think is pretty impressive. They were a great study group too. And yes, and all of the research that I did, there were large parts of it about the rural women's organizations and how they kept each other sane and gave them enrichment. One woman who was from Red Oak went on to become the state president of the Women's Federation, or the Federation of Women's Clubs, and then actually became the president on the national level. And in an interview, she said, "Women, even though we love our children, need a break." I thought that was quite fitting for a 1952 interview. So, yes, women needed the company of other women, and they needed mental stimulation and intellectual development as well. And I was going to try to find one thing. Someone mentioned about the history of the Cedar Rapids Library and when they made it into the Art Center. When the Carnegie Library was built, they had set aside a large room on the second floor that would be used by the Art Association for art exhibits and classes. But what happened was that the collection became so large so quickly that they needed more space and they couldn't fit in there. And so then they eventually they bought the Torch Press building downtown in Cedar Rapids. And that's the one I remember is when they were in there in the Torch Press building. And it was, it was really quite an accomplishment to be able to secure that building and to devote it completely to art. And the other part is that when we, in 1982, when we were working to have a new library, at that point in time, I was an advocate through Junior League for the new library. And I went to lots of council meetings. And when I knew the council was, or I guess, was it still called the city council? But anyway, the mayor and then the different members of, because we changed our form of government, but I think they were still called councilmen. I have to go back. But anyway, when it became clear that the city was going to support building a new library, I remember at one meeting, the Parks Commissioner, Stan Reynes, said in the middle of it, he said, "I am very unhappy with this decision." But he got money then in a couple of years. But there was an interview and I was quite pregnant and I was standing on the steps of the what's now, the art museum and KCRG was interviewing me, and the cameraman was down at the base of the steps shooting up. So here I am in just a, a voluminous. I looked like the Chinese spy balloons with this little head on the top. And that went on TV. And I mean, they passed the issue for the library, but there I was, just, a vast amount of me advocating for that. But then my children got to go sit in that beautiful leather hand when it was part of the new library. But it also is just so wonderful that the Art Association, the Art Center, was able then to use that gorgeous library building and expand it. And so we have these two wonderful, wonderful institutions, our library and our art museum, and many, many others. But these are two that just have always been near and dear to my heart.
Check out the chat, Sylvia, because there's a really interesting comment about Sioux City.
Yes, I just saw that.
That's yours, Jane? Is that yours? Yeah.
Oh, we'll have to chat. We'll have to talk about that.
I mean, the connections are deep there, Jane, with
Yes.
the Club thing. It's great.
Wonderful. That's amazing information. And I'm always just so interested in that. And that whole concept of the women and their study groups. And now in Cedar Rapids, the garden itself now has a new support group called Friends of the Shakespeare Garden. And they are working hard to restore, because 2008, the flood just wiped it out. And then, of course, we've had derecho, but they are working hard to get the funding to restore it. And since it is in a public park there now, it's very complicated because it has to be ADA accessible, and we have to remember to use certain kinds of plantings because of the need for native plantings, as well as having the touch of England and Shakespeare there. So again, thank you everybody for listening here. Let me get Barb Feller in here. She is a fabulous person to work with, and we have had so many good times as we discussed things. So this club or this group club here has brought together many, many people. Yeah, just one last comment that I was very interested in some of the research I was doing. There is something called fandom, F-A-N-D-O-M, and it is an academic study. I see Mike is nodding his head, and so is Joe. It is something that was totally new to me when I started reading about it. And that'll be for another time, somebody can research that. But the Shakespeare clubs of the early 20th century are part of their the studies of fandom groups, and it is a really interesting concept about how fandom groups really serve a purpose much beyond just reading the plays of Shakespeare. Not that that's just any little thing, but
Well, Sylvia, fandom groups, it sounds so frivolous when you put it that way.
Yeah.
And really deceptively not, but I suppose one could say this form is in the fandom sphere to some degree.
I decided it was.
We can all characterize it for ourselves and our own individual purposes. I would encourage that.
Yeah. Okay, you've seen me long enough. I'm moving and Barb's coming in.
No, that's
Well,
Does anybody have any more questions? And Nancy, Debbie is asking whether we have
Debbie,
a photo of the entrance.
oh no, and I was going to make a for that. I'm still searching for a photo of the original entrance. And if anybody happens to stumble upon one, around 1930, I would be so grateful to have access to that.
Is that a
And-
project for the History Center? Would they have some?
Well, maybe I have talked with them and I need to go in person, I think, now that the pandemic is not quite so much of a threat, and look through some things, and maybe the public library in their archives have something. One other thing I wanted to mention, the current entrance to the Shakespeare Garden was designed by Eliza Hickok, whose husband was, well, I guess he was the president of Cole College at one time. And then the architectural firm of Brown, Healy and Bach, fixed it up, did the blueprint.
Mrs. Higley was also responsible for the city cemetery being moved to Oak Hill before Oak Hill even existed. It was on her property and she didn't want it there. So right across from where the Colonial Bakery was the city cemetery. And supposedly they were to move every grave out of that cemetery.
Oh,
And nobody knows for sure if that happened or not, but my guess is probably not. And now you may notice that it no longer exists. The buildings that were there are all gone. And I don't know what happened with that, but I'm assured that there's probably a few bones left someplace underneath some buildings.
oh, thank you for sharing that.
The other thing I wanted to suggest was W.E.B. Du Bois was married in Cedar Rapids.
Ooh,
And not very many people know that, but his wife, her husband, her wife's father was in the 54th Mass, and he's buried in Oak Hill Cemetery as well. But those people were free Black folks, and I've been trying to figure them out because I get all kinds of information. It's a little strange. Some say some of those, her parents were like born in France, but I kind of doubt that they were born in France, but that's what you hear. And her dad was a cook in one of the hotels, and her brother, I believe, was also working in one of the hotels in Cedar Rapids. But there's not a whole lot of information that you get because there just isn't much there. But I think that that's kind of interesting, the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois came all the way to Cedar Rapids to get married. And he did get married in a Black church. He got married in the Church of the Brethren, which I
That's
thought was also
interesting.
kind of interesting.
That must have been his first wife then, Steve, huh?
Yes,
Nina,
yes,
Nina Gomer Du Bois?
yes.
Okay. And I'm looking him up and there's a comment. He grew up in a relatively tolerant and integrated community.
Yeah.
It said, but he was born in Barrington, Massachusetts. So I don't know how long he spent in Cedar Rapids, whether it was just to get married and he got the heck out. I don't know.
Yeah. I think he met his wife in college. And they came here to get married because that was her home.
Okay. All right, well, that's an interesting connection. He's an interesting guy, that's for sure.
It'd be interesting to find out if his wife's mother was involved with some of those social groups, the Black social groups.
Yeah, for sure.
I know
Does-
you're going to get right on it.
Well, it might not take much to find out because I've got this one book right here. That's that history book of African Americans in Iowa that was published there in Cedar Rapids. I'll look up her name in the index while we're doing some other stuff.
Okay. Barb and Sylvia, I think the Museum of Art has a picture of that entrance. I think they do anyway. And Barb, you would know that.
Wouldn't I?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have
think you're
seen
right.
it. Excuse me, I don't know if it's in the scrapbook that's in the studio, but I know I have seen the picture
Yeah.
of some people standing beside that entrance where you can actually see the thatched roof.
Mhm.
So I know it's there somewhere. I'll look.
We'll have to check it out.
Check that out.
Thank you, Nancy.
Well, how's everybody doing? You got any more questions or comments? Otherwise, we might be able to kind of just segue into women's voices, creative voices of the era.
Thanks a lot, Elaine, and thank you, Barb and Sylvia, for such a great presentation. It really sets this up very well. And I know Elaine talked about, this is a poetry thing, but it really isn't. I want to just say, I talked last time about using an artifact as a way to examine the history, the culture, what was present at the time, capturing a moment. So this was the artifact that I'm using this evening. And I'm not really talking too much about form tonight, unless you see that form is being used as a way to resist something that is traditional. So I'm going to just bear with me while I bring this presentation up. And okay, there we go. And do that. Oh, sorry. Here we go. There we go. Can you see it? Women's work in Iowa Poets and Anthology. Elaine, could you nod your head yes if you can see it?
Yes, we can see
Okay.
it and hear
Awesome.
you.
Yes.
Great, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so women's work, and this time when we talk about women's work, we're talking about their written work, their literary work, and I'm talking about it specifically in a book. It was quite an undertaking that was published in 1935. It's called Iowa Poets, an anthology of 69 contemporaries. And I know at least one other person out there has this book, and I'm just thrilled to hear that. This is great. We're going to talk a lot about this book. We're going to talk about the attitudes at the time, and we're going to talk about what was important to women, what they were writing, and maybe even why it wasn't receiving the attention, that kind of work that it should have from male contemporaries. So here's the book. I know I shared it with you last time. I held it up. Iowa Poets with a foreword by J.G. Sigmund. And here's the title page. So we have an anthology of 69 contemporaries, a frontispiece by Grant Wood. I'll be sharing that. A literary map by Harriet Macy. I don't know if any of you have heard of the artist Harriet Macy, but I'm going to talk about her. And this is edited by Henry Harrison. He has his own publishing house out of New York. So first of all, when you open this book, you're going to see this amazing literary map and lists of names. And these are all of the contributors to this book, as well as a map of where some of the people who are famous on this literary map. There's a little section that talks about that. I'm going to kind of zoom in on some of those here in just a moment, and some of the clubs. So I'm so glad you talked about clubs. We've got the Iowa Authors Club represented. We have the Iowa Art Guild represented. And it seems like there was something else. Oh my goodness. Anyway, I guess it was just the people that are on the map that are called out in particular. But you can just kind of see the concentration of, these different people, where they lived, and yeah, and then over in the left-hand bottom corner, you see a little ink and quill there, and it's next to the names of some of the publications that either clubs were responsible for or organizations. And we're going to look at that here in just a minute. But first of all, who created this map? this woman named Harriet Macy, who was born in Des Moines in 1883. She was one of 3 children born to Iowa pioneer settlers. They were William P. Macy of Indiana and Augustus C. Arnold Macy of New York. The Macys moved from Oskaloosa to Des Moines in 1879, and they were part of the founding team of instructors for Drake University in 1881. WP taught natural science and Mrs. Macy taught drawing and painting. She is a contemporary of Grant Wood, or she was a contemporary of Grant Wood. And I certainly never heard of her before, but I'm glad that we have an opportunity to talk about her work and the importance of the representation of the literary community that is Iowa, or that was Iowa at the time, because they certainly didn't have the communications that we do now. They couldn't just get on a Zoom and, hey, we're going to talk to Ruth in Northwest Iowa and Rupert down in Southeast Iowa. It was very interesting, and there you can see that there's kind of a concentration, obviously, around metro areas where you're going to see the literary map, really more populated. And I love the representation at the bottom left-hand corner of the wagon train for the Mormon Trail. So I love that. Very interesting. So here are some of the, I kind of blew up some of these different organizations, since we've been talking about organizations. We've got the Iowa Art Guild, and I don't know if there are any other familiar names on there, but you can see that the Stone City Colony is represented. Grant Wood's name is on that. The Iowa Authors Club, you'll see there are names from the Iowa Authors Club that you'll see represented as contributors to the anthology. And here are the people that are represented in the literary map of Iowa. These are writers, not necessarily poets. They are writers who put Iowa on the map. So you can see there, it's mostly men, not all men, but you'll see Mary Caspi represented. I'm going to be talking more about her in this. And so, yeah, very interesting. Good stuff. Love it. And here's the frontispiece. Happy birthday. How ironic. It's Grant Wood's birthday. And here's a little happy birthday frontispiece from this book. And this was from March 24th, 1931. And I'm not exactly sure what date that represents. It's certainly not the publication date, but it might be the date that the idea was birthed and launched. It took several years for this book to come together, from what I've read. So maybe this was the birth of the idea that was going to go on and become this first, as far as I know, first compilation of Iowa poets. And I found this very interesting. In the back of the book, there are ads. So we've got our Yonkers ad in there, as well as our ad from Drake. And maybe there's no small coincidence that Harriet Macy taught at Drake, and we've got a Drake ad. So why not? Maybe it was her payment for doing that work. We don't know. So I'm going to read the publisher's preface here by Henry Harrison, and just kind of ignore the text on the left if you can. As I read this, any anthology which pretends to be representative and comprehensive must necessarily include all kinds of verse. No state can boast of good poets only, not that it would care to boast of poor ones. And so are given here the worthy and perhaps not so worthy, making this collection both human and complete. After all, a state is much like a mother, and it must claim its less distinguished children along with the preferred. There is always the certainty that even minor poems will find their admirers. So what does this tell you about what Harrison thinks about this book? And you can just unmute and say what you're thinking. I can't see when I have it like this, but what do you think Harrison thought about this book?
I think he's trying to be diplomatic, maybe about maybe what some of the poets have contributed, maybe.
I totally agree. He's backpedaling to start this off. And I don't think a publisher would do that today. But yes, Julie, I think you're right. And he also talks about the process a little bit. He says, I'll just kind of paraphrase. He said that there are some poets who aren't represented, but he said, rest assured, everybody was asked to contribute. And everybody, they could have up to 3 pages. So you might find some poets listed that have several poems. And by the way, the reason, obviously this was just focused on poetry. I want you to think about this could be prose as well. I don't know of a similar prose work, but this could be said about maybe prose writers at the time. Anyway, so he concludes by saying, it is hoped that readers will be encouraged to discover for themselves other poems of these poets by reading the books of their authors and looking for their work in contemporary periodicals. And the book does list the periodicals of the time. That's kind of interesting. You'll see more newspapers or, things that we would consider to be maybe more club focused, as well as poetry magazine, right? Which, then and now is still a top literary magazine. But in this work of 69 contributors, 48 contributors are easily identifiable as women. And I say that because some people use initials. And I know that was a more common tactic for men, but, you'd see sometimes, an initial, a middle name. Not sure if that's a middle name for a man or a woman, but I just want to be sure. The people who are identified as women, more than 2/3 of them are women contributing to this anthology. What subjects do the women write about? Well, both men and women were writing pastorals. And when I say that, I'm talking about basically nature poetry. Of course, nature poetry that's rhyming. We talked a lot about that last week. They talk about gardens. They talk about agriculture. I'm throwing cosmos in here too. Cosmos and spiritual. Is that pastoral? Well, I'm just throwing it in here. They talk about love. And really, this is more the genre for women than for men, although there is some reference to attitudes about love and about affection and how it's distributed, from both genders. The topic of motherhood, home, family, even some an anti-war poem, definitely the territory of women. Tension in traditional women's roles. Why are we not surprised to see that? When we hear Sylvia talk about all of the clubs that were available to urban women, and we talk about, there's presence of this in the rural areas as well. Women, they needed something. They needed something to call their own. Some of these women were educated, highly educated. And some of them had paid help, perhaps, or some of them they were suffering from lack of access to something outside of a traditional role. And you're also going to see times when some of these women are breaking form. And what I mean by breaking form is literally in terms of, okay, here's a typical forms of the time, and they break with that. But then they also, in terms of content, are breaking with the form of what do they talk about that, is different from what men talk about. Why is that not valued? Why is that in 1935, I would say between 1931 and 1935, considered to be something that does not capture the interest of the literary set? Or who comprises the literary set? That's a better question. So here's the foreword by J. Sigmund. And I'm bringing in this quote. Before I start, I have a couple of things highlighted here that I wanted to call out in the introduction. I wanted to remind you of what he said last time in an interview or in some writing, is that poetry is not a thing of far off places, right? That's kind of the idea behind regionalism. You can see it, you can find it right at hand. He held that poetry exists in the daily living of a life, and that rhythm is the great scheme of things present even in our pulse. All locales could yield their overtones if one is sensitive enough to register them. So why is it that motherhood, home, family, love, marriage, those kinds of topics are not the kinds of topics that men were writing about? I think it's an interesting question. In this introduction, I'm pulling this out, and I have another quote on the next page to call out. He says, this is the first paragraph. There are two ways to judge how the bird songs of the community would blend and what sort of overtones they would hold. One way would be to walk through the countryside in late spring on a morning when only the larks, the brown thrushes, and the catbirds, which are the most skillful singers, were piping their songs. Another way would be to wait until after high noon on a day when a rain had just ceased and hear blending with the bird symphony the voices of less skillful singers, such as the oriole, the chat, and even more raucous songsters like the cardinal, or even the sober-coated and almost inarticulate yellow-billed cuckoo. How's he setting up this anthology? Kind of like Harrison, maybe? Let's look at what he says over here. And I kind of highlighted where the paragraph that I'm looking at. This volume, it seems to me, is credible evidence that there are visibly at work in Iowa some poets of real merit. Yes, I can go farther than that. I think there is visibly at work in Iowa at least one great poet and several minor poets whose work will live. This is not the place to set forth a critical estimate of the work of Paul Engel, but how can a native Iowan refrain when he has such an opportunity as this from pointing to him as a figure whose song is colossal? It is difficult in this foreword. In fact, it is prohibitive because of the confines of space to mention all of the poets in Iowa for whom this writer has a profound respect. But Thomas W. Duncan, Mary Caspi, Edwin Ford Piper, Raymond Kerensky, Don Farron, and Lewis Worthington Smith, to mention no others, have done enough good work to give them the right of entrance in any important anthology. How many women are mentioned out of 2/3 who contributed to this anthology? One. Okay, and she's amazing. I have some work of hers to show you. So, I don't want to come down too hard on Jay Sigmund because he definitely reflects the attitude of the time. This is a person who does not have academic credentials, who is really intimidated by critics who do. And I think that this is, he and Harrison, they looked at this and they said, yeah, it's not all Paul Engel. Not everybody's a Paul Engel. Well, only Paul Engel is Paul Engel. He's colossal. These others, okay, they're okay, but this has to be representative. So here we go. Hold your noses. These topics just, I don't know, they may not appeal to you, but we're going to look at what women have to say. Okay. Well, first of all, we're going to start out with the colossal Paul Engel. And I love Paul Engel. I'm not trying to cast any aspersions on his work because it is amazing. But here we've got a sonnet here. Does anybody want to read this, or should I just I'll go ahead and read it. Society and Moonlight. And we're going to talk a little bit about the theme in this. This is very interesting. Forlornly free of other men's conventions, he loafs and finds a boxcar for his bed. His pride is hurt if any housewife mentions a lick of work to justify his bread. He begs his way down to a pauper's grave, a parasite on any heart that heeds him. He scorns the man who never needs a shave and damns the same society that feeds him. Okay, so we're talking about a guy doing the spiral, right? He's definitely working his way down in life. And then we've got the volta, which is the turn in poets, we know that. Behind the bitter cringing of his eyes, the hand that trembles as it asks a dime. The little fire of memory may flare, lighting old recollection of a time when he drew pay and heard a baby's cries and stroked soft moonlight on a woman's hair. So this is somebody who's lost his family. And we don't know if that was the narrator's choice, if that was, back in 1918, there were, I just read the most wonderful book by a writer, Eva Bryant Voigt, who talks about the Great War and the Spanish flu pandemic and the number of people who were lost to that. I myself have, through my ancestry research, I know my grandfather ended up being farmed out to relatives because his mother passed away in the Spanish flu, and his father, he couldn't stand the pain or didn't think he was going to be fit as a father, so he left. So, there were a lot of tensions in society at this time. So it's interesting, an interesting poem. Then in the paragraph below, the one where Sigmund calls out, here are the poets you should pay attention to. He said, here's like a few poems that really are worthy of a second look. And this poem by L. Dale Aaron is a poem, he said, this is worthy of a second look. And it's just this short little thing. And I want you to think about this as we go through these other poems by the women that we'll read. Sea Dog, wedded to land, this lover of seas dares not hear the water call. He must narrow his heart to roar of trees and the splash of rain against the wall. So here's somebody who maybe grew up along a coast. They've immigrated. They live in Iowa now, and this is their new water that they get to love. And so in Sigmund's opinion, this is worth a second look. Okay, so I'm going to start with one by Mary Caspi, and I think there's a really interesting oops here. So it's lines to comfort a beloved. Okay, it sounds like it's going to be just this beautiful rhyming poem, but look at this. When I lines to comfort a beloved philanderer. Does that change what we think this poem is going to be about? And Mary, I love Mary. She's sassy. And I'm just going to read a little bit about her. I could not find very much about any of these women authors, but this was probably the most I could find. In 1930, Mary Caspi self-published Call Me Mary. She was a secretary for the manager of the Marshall Hughes Company in Des Moines. I don't know anything about her life, except in Des Moines, there was a wealthy Jewish family who helped start a foundation and other Jewish families who funded an organization with property that was specifically for Jewish families and education. So I don't know if she's related to that family at all, but it makes sense that maybe she is. So would anybody like to read Lines to Comfort a Beloved Philanderer?
I'll give it a try, Dawn.
All right, thank you, Julie.
Lines to comfort a beloved philanderer. Any man, dear, like as not, if cornered on the well-known spot, will do as you did. Any man will slide to safety if he can. Any male thing, good or bad, if he were tired of what he had. Wow. And surveys showed he'd have more fun if quits were called and love were done. Would stage his exit from the mess, if possible with your finesse and ease and polished courtesy. My dear, you must not be conscience stricken at the end. With proper care, my heart will mend, and since a jilt was imminent, 'twere better done by some swell gent like you, my love. You hurt me, but you did not mean so deep a cut, than by a man who just for fun, the lowdown skunk, will hit and run. I'm satisfied. I love that. That's
I
awesome.
know. She has a lot of irony and sass, and it's almost satirical in a way. And you have to love that, in terms of what women are writing about, you've got this kind of I mean, if you're going to compare it to a contemporary, a current, entertainer, it might be a Taylor Swift breakup poem or a breakup song, right? And it's like, I'm going to cast, aspersions your way, even though she says, oh, she's not. But, and the thing that I love about this is that she does write a little bit against form, which is fantastic. So if you look at this, and you might probably notice in Julie's reading, there is rhyme in it. You've got these rhyme couplets all the way through. And what was so traditional at the end, even if they weren't rhyme couplets, they're probably rhyme couplet at the end. It's not. It's like it hits a clinker, right? I'm satisfied. And that's part of what Mary did, is she kind of broke the rules in a really refreshing way. And my hat goes off to Mary. Here's another Mary poem. I Was the Night. Does anybody else want to read this poem? It's a short little poem. Okay, I will. I was the night. I was the night harboring your love. I was the yellow moon you looked upon and the velvet grass beneath you. I was the breeze whose fingers caressed you. I was the shadow on your brow. I was your peace and tumult and desire. I was your prison in your ultimate release. I am the morning, repentant. When we look at this poem, one of the things that we notice is lacking. There's no rhyme. There's no rhyme in this at all. And what was it J. Sigmund said he had a terrible time writing? It was free verse. This is set up as a little bit of a litany poem, or what we might call almost as a list poem today. But she did not adhere to the conventions of rhyme, although there were new conventions present in the world. And there she is at the very end. I am the morning, repentant. So it's very, very interesting how she's doing her writing. So we also talked about, we have pastorals, and I want to say in these two little poems here, that one by Dorothy Cobble-Dries, Little House in Iowa, and also My Cottage by Mildred Marsh. They're talking about really kind of a rejection of urbanization. I'm going to read here in My Cottage, very short. Beside a country road, my cottage stands. Fresh honeysuckle shades the kitchen door. My children play about my feet. I loathe the crowds that throng the street. Here I have peace and rest with those who love me best. My family is so dear. I didn't see anything like this by a man in this book. And Little House in Iowa I'm not going to read this one, but it's really beautiful in the way that this woman, the narrator, is captured by the beautiful space and feeling and beauty of nature that she sees surrounding this house that's for sale or rent, and how she decides to move from the city and to set up in, so now I dwell among pine woods where wild things nest. I wish folks knew the pleasure in a lone byway. I like my little house of gray. So she's returning to the country, kind of like nature as a healer, which is, it's a very contemporary theme in women's poetry right now. Environmental or eco poetry, you'll see nature established as a healer. So while there were many pastoral poems by men, it wasn't quite the same. So I think these two are really nice in their representation of that. Okay, this one by Orpha S. Diebert. I swear she's, you're going to hear some things in this one that perhaps, we think about. Here's maybe what it is that women what they really are looking for. So would anybody like to read Women Like to Weep?
Sure, I'll do that this time, if you like.
All right, thanks, Elaine.
Women like to weep. Our little house, how fortunate that we could have it all planned and built before our wedding day. And still 100 things yet must be done before it reaches out its welcome arms and says to all who enter, this is home. Today we'll lay the rugs, the ones we bought, while Charles is here to help. Then I can place the smaller ones myself after the men have set the furniture. We'll have to lunch out in the breakfast nook, but by tomorrow night we'll dine in state. Such busy, busy days, the spices to arrange and linens sort, such happy, happy days with curtains to be draped and pictures hung. And every night when Charles comes home at dusk, a smile and song to rest him from his work. At last, the final touch. Each little room is perfect in its way. The chairs just so, the slippers by the hearth, the salad and dessert done hours ago. How long the day. My book, how dull and cheap. I'll lie down on this little couch and weep.
Thank you, Elaine. So what is the narrator in this poem saying about domesticity, or establishing what looks like on the outside and the inside a perfect little life, little perfect marriage? What is she saying? What was that? I didn't catch that.
Don,
Yes.
this is Sylvia.
Yes.
I almost included this poem in my talk because I thought this is probably the way lots of women felt in those years, and that was why they sought the company of other women in their organizations. But yes, I almost included that.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Yeah. I think Betty Friedan could have written Feminine Mystique before 1958. I think, that was the premise for that book. And so I think this is a very interesting representation. It is something that, could certainly, it's not mentioned by Sigmund or Harrison as being, let's look at this one. What is Orpha Diebert trying to tell us? So yeah, very interesting. Here we have, I'm going to start, there are 3 poems. I think I have 3 poems in here about being a mother, or having one's mother near, or what role women who are mothers have played in establishing a homeland. So I'm not going to read my mother's voice. I just wanted to call out that here's a really beautiful mother poem. And the one by Ethel Blythe Penningroth. Did somebody say they were related to Ethel? Okay. Well, I'm going to read this one because, again, if we think about the times that this book was published in, right, this would have come after, or was it during World War I? But this is to the world's mothers. I sent my lover to one war. I shall not send my son. The world may call me slack or oft, but when all's said and done, he shall not go with my blessing. It was not in my plan to create cheap cannon fodder. I met him for a man. 'Tis true my lover came again to me without a scratch, none visible to eye forsooth, but show me wound to match the wounds left on our soldiers' hearts. The scar upon the soul is greater curse than body harm. War is the fool's goal. Across the sea are other lads, no older now than mine, busy at fishing, playing ball, at all the joys divine that boyhood knows. They are as dear to each and every mother as mine to me. Why teach them how to murder one another? It is because we hold so dear the warlord's loud demands. Is it because we avidly seek wealth or power or lands? Or are we purblind, willing to deny our Prince of Peace? When we shall live, not prate, God will to men, then war shall cease. And what if that perchance should mean goodwill to boys as well? What if Christ's way, taught young, could spare them manhood's blackest hell? Would not worldwide boy friendliness mean that world peace is won? I sent my lover to one hell. Oh, please God, not my son. To the world's mothers. I saw nothing like this written by a man in that book. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This
Dawn.
poem. Yes, yes.
Sorry to interrupt again. This
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
woman that I think is related to my cousin,
Okay.
Ethel
Awesome.
Blythe.
Mhm.
And Penningroth, there's a family in Cedar Rapids. There was a Penningroth who was a judge. And I think there's a connection there with those people. But it's amazing when I think about this poem coming out of Williamsburg, I think around Williamsburg, Iowa, and the depth of this poem and the passion.
Yes.
I love this poem.
Yes, thank you so much. I do too. I think it's just absolutely gorgeous. And there's another one here. Thank you so much for that, Sylvia. I really appreciate that. As many local connections as we can make. I think that's amazing.
Hey,
And
Dawn? Oh,
yes, go ahead. No, go ahead.
well, when you mentioned Jay Sigmund and women, I had to go. So when it's time, I found a very short poem by Jay Sigmund that piggybacks with the poem you just did about the woman crying about the philanderer. And
Okay.
so it's quite something.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm going to get to this another piece that has yes, you'll know when. And I know that we're getting later in the program, but I won't read The Spirit of a Pioneer Mother, but it's basically this narrator is speaking as the pioneer mother who's dead and buried, bones are crumbling, and there's obviously some discussion. And I appreciate, Steve, that we talked about that cemetery move. Right, it says, don't move my bones, because basically, let me lie on this hillside, disturb me not, I had to die. It was my fate to give my all for the birth of state. So, this, and the writer G. Pearl Schmidt dedicates this to a heroine of 1848. So, these, the legacy is very deep in the pens of these women who are writing. I'm not going to read the Ethel Skipton Beringer poem, My Love. She does a little bit of an ekphrastic take on Robert Burns' A Red, Red Rose poem about what her love is not like. It's not this, fragile rose, not like the violet, the peace of the grass, but it's more enduring like the laurel green, which I think is very interesting and very good. Tale of Amoret by Zella Wallace. It kind of goes back a little bit to women. Women love to weep. Romance bestows its mignonette. Reality brings bassinet. She who was once a lithe coquette, a scintillating gay brunette, now prides herself on meat croquette. Once opera cloak and rose Georgette, now diapers, mop, and kitchenette. A little tongue in cheek, but no, not really. This is, I think it's a delightful little poem. Rosabelle Houston. I don't know this woman. I looked her up, and the only thing I could find is that she was from Southern Iowa, and that she and her family ended up moving to Salt Lake City. So I don't know for sure that was her or her family, but there's a poem here called Shackles, and it's about, again, I just don't have time to read it, but it's about a mother's, she's a childbearer, under her heart a baby lies. She hopes he may be a son. Her toil is lightened by the hope that she's going to have the son. And, basically it's a painful poem about, the plight of poverty or women living off the land. And it kind of all comes back, she has these prayers, and yet she's always aware of this child growing inside of her. I like this one very much. A mood which comes after being jilted. I thrust my chin the further to catch the last glimpse of your retreating figure. I have the crazy thought that my eyes will, for the rest of my life, see nothing but the illusion of a dot on the horizon. And I think this is the beginning of my career as a writer of love poems. For who but a disappointed woman has the time to write love poems? So, does this one have form? Is Rosabelle breaking form? She is. And maybe we understand why. And she also wrote this poem. Again, not enough time to read it, but just a really provocative title. What happened to a female who started out liking life in the raw? And it's this woman who imagines, life as a woman in the street, but yet how she still is surrounded by, these men with monotonous, barren minds, and her china and her tea, and so it's fascinating.
Hey, Dawn,
Love
I
it.
have a question about
Yes.
that one, if I could.
Uh-huh. Mhm.
So, and maybe you know more about this or other poets on the call, but her using a long title like that, I kind of thought that was a more contemporary thing.
Evidently not. Yeah,
Evidently not.
evidently not. It really is the only one in the collection that I can see uses a 2-line title. However, the poem "To a Beloved Philanderer" should have been a 2-line title, and he just left that off. He left philanderer off because, oh my gosh, it'd be 2 lines. So I don't know if it was just an honest mistake, but yeah, this really tells what this poem is about and makes it something that is going to capture the attention of the reader and really set it apart. So some of the people, and this, again, she's breaking form. I'm really glad you called that out, Julie. So awesome. This one, and Elaine, we can talk maybe a little bit about J. Sigmund's poem here in just a minute, but I am going to read this just really quickly. This is an Italian or Petrarchan sonnet by a woman named Anne Winslow called Satyr. He is a satyr with a satyr's crude chaplet of rough gray hair above his ears. Sometimes a tuft or two of this appears to be the horns that connate the lewd thoughts playing with his effervescent mood behind ingratiating husks of leers. A lovely lady passes and he cheers perceptibly. He sees her in the nude. The lady listens, and her charm is spent, beguiling this old devil for some days until the wine no longer meets his lips. Then off he goes for fresh diversement. The images that crowd his fevered ways are those of curves and breasts and hips and hips. So she doesn't break form in terms of iambic pentameter, which is fascinating. It looks like she has, but she hasn't. So let's compare this with Paul Engel. Do you remember this from last time, The Steps in the Snow, where the narrator is trying to decide, oh, I'm going home from wherever and crushing these black holes in the stove. Do I go home to the wife and the kids clamoring for to be taken on the knee, or do I go to the harlot's house and renew? I mean, so the colossal Paul Engel is writing about this same thing that Anne Winslow is, only she's providing a different point of view from him. So it's the other side of the conversation. So we'll celebrate his work as colossal, and we'll ignore her work. Ironic, isn't it? And so maybe this is a good time to share the J. Sigmund piece.
Well, yeah, and it's called Rubbish. And it's from this collection, The Plowman Sings. And
Okay.
Barbara, I know you know that book. Rubbish. Today I watched a toothless hag groping feverishly with a hooked iron rod in the foul refuse of the city's dump. Her frayed garments and her sallow countenance harmonized weirdly with her surroundings as the color of a worm matches old wood. Her shriveled lips bore a cynical sneer like the grin of a drying corpse. And constantly she muttered as she jabbed this way and that, "Why is it men always cast aside that of which they tire, while women hide it to cry over?"
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. See. So,
I-
That one is
Yeah.
by Jay Sigmund.
yeah,
Yes.
yes, it
Wow.
is.
Hmm.
He was an observer of the human condition. You know, in my experience of reading his things, just a very keen observer. He really got down to the earthy recesses of
Yeah.
a lot of people's lives.
Yeah. But what point of view, I mean, is there, what point of view or empathy is he able to take for women? I don't know. It's really interesting. It's really interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely, I think there's, well, and just the themes in it, pre social safety net and the hard times and
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, thank you so much for sharing that. And there's just one last poem I want to share, and it's again by Rosabelle Houston. This is The Three Fondest. And I want to just say that I think in this poem, I see so much, and they're just short little vignettes, that are almost put together as a sequence, that are very minimalist. And you're going to be, it's a head scratcher, but it's also really lovely. And it's told, from a first person point of view. Some of it is, at least the first little vignette is, but I think it's minimalist. And to me, it's very contemporary. I think about Jean Valentine, who's a famous minimalist poet, when I read this, but I'll just start. The Three Fondest, New York City. Old shoe of my foot, old thread of my worn coat, first mocker of my lazy dreams. It is good happiness to curl my finger round your thumb and ridicule the world from Brooklyn Bridge. Pittsburgh, jade to be wooed before dawn, lean and lank and brown leg and short of lip with low hung breasts, like apples stuck on trunk of tree. All hell is in her look and in her walk. And once your eyes meet hers, you'll think no woman lovelier than one who's lean and lank and brown of leg. Cleveland, blood of your fingers mark the careful stitch on stitch of your well-patterned rug, woman. Peeping cautiously from your cultured throne, you need fear no other woman wears a brighter plume than you, and no one will guess the wrinkles in your hands. Does this one follow a form? No. This is almost of her own making. I love the sass as at the same time, as well as the grittiness of this poem. It's striking. And I've read it several times, and I could read it several more. I just think it's amazing. And I'm sorry anybody ever overlooked Rosabelle Houston. So I'm going to just leave you with a little bit of a challenge, and this is called Through Their Eyes. And as you're writing your pieces, and I know some of you're already done, and maybe you're thinking, oh, could I do more? Maybe. So I want you to think about what conversations you imagine with the art of Grant Wood through the lens of Midwestern women or I'm saying othered individuals in the 1930s. Who would be othered individuals? Minorities, homosexuals. I mean, there are lots of reasons. I mean, people with disabilities, people who've gone through trauma. There are lots of othered individuals that we could think of.
Native Iowans.
Yeah, Native Iowans. Exactly. So does that view entail place and landscape? So we've heard some of those. An unheard interior voice based on the role of mother, wife, lover, other. Is it resistant? Is it resilient? How does it respond to the changing world? And think about, have you heard stories from your relatives about life in the early 20th century? And I'm going to say the 1930s to 50s that remind you of the women's voices you heard tonight. What poems would you write in first person on their behalf? So it's kind of, it's interesting, you know, imagine that you're, you know, you're a narrator in a Mary Caspi poem or a Roosevelt Houston poem. You know, what does that look like? If you look at, if you know, if you're using a Grant Wood piece as a prompt, how might you write? How much you write those stories? My mother is going to be 95 next month. And I swear, the new stories, she can't remember the old stories, but the new stories that are coming out of her, it's like finding loose change in the cushions of a couch. It's very interesting how some of these things, you know, come up, and it's like, wow, I've never heard that. So I am going to stop sharing.
Marilyn, you got something?
I just wanted to mention briefly that some of those names that and poems that Dawn was sharing this evening are very prominent poets in Iowa Poetry Association. And in fact, Agnes Flannery, whose name was up there, she was the founder of IPA. Roger Krasinski is the president at the very beginning. So you've got the folks that actually start up Iowa Poetry Association, and you've got their poems here tonight. So other names that were up there was Grace Hunter. She's in there as well. You know, so there's a bunch of these folks. So I just thought I'd share that with you.
I'm so happy you did. My suspicion is that Iowa Authors Group was the beginning. It had to be the beginning of Iowa Poetry Association.
Yep. And
so thank you for sharing that.
This is what we do. Find all those paths and just keep following the trail, winding back around. So boy,
so
well,
yeah, thank you for listening, and thank you so much for your contributions. It makes it's a really interesting story. And you know, this group, you guys, you know so much about the culture and history of the time, and I love all of the connections that we're able to make. So it's very, very exciting.
Well, thank you so much, Dawn, for hopping kind of that archival historic vibe. That was fabulous that you made that connection to help us, you know, stitch some of these elements of the forum together. And so just really appreciate that. And not unlike what our presenters are doing, you know, it's just like we can just go from art to culture to history to creative writing and words and back and forth again. So again, I encourage you to contact each other if you want to. Let me know if you have ideas for things, you know, that you could see this forum doing in the future. Always open to those ideas. Submit your words. Don't judge them, just submit them. And we'll have our own. I honestly didn't really realize that our chronicle had a precedent almost of in the forms of that anthology. We're a little bit different, but you know, not totally poetry, but I like the jumping off place that.
And I've never seen an editor's note from Marilyn that would be like the publisher's preface by Henry Harrison, like, yeah,
oh yeah,
or Jay Sigmund, yes. It's like, yeah, some of these are not so good, but right, never. Right, we're proud of the poets in Iowa.
Question before we leave, Marilyn. How many submissions are each person able to enter the Grant Wood Chronicle? Oh, it's not for you. I'm sorry. Grant Wood Chronicle contest. You might be are you thinking of the Grant Wood Country Award through IPA? If so, that's one poem for that award, right, Marilyn? Marilyn?
Any individual can enter 5 poems, and they can choose what contest they want to enter it into. So you can enter 5 poems in the Grant Wood Country Poetry contest. So you can put all 5 in that category if you want to, but only 1 poem per poet will be published, and only 1 award, you know, is given to 1 person. So it's like, if you decide to enter all 5 in that contest, that's it. You can put one you can spread them out and put one in 5 different contests. You can put 2 in one. I don't care where you put your 5 poems, in other words, but in the end, only one of your poems will be published and can win an award. Does that make sense? Did I say that correctly?
That helps. You could, yeah, you could load up with those.
Absolutely,
Elaine?
absolutely.
Elaine, and I'm glad that Marilyn reiterated that, but I think that the question that Patricia had was how many for the Country Chronicle itself?
Okay, so, no, for that, there's no limit. You can submit as many as you like. And my policy is as long as there's space, I'll publish it. So, and this year we're gonna have, we're gonna highlight a few as editor's choice focal points. So that's kind of new this year on that. Because the goal of this forum is to have those of you who are listening and rolling around in this content, in this learning, all of it, that those voices are highlighted and included in the Chronicle. So that's what it's a little, it's not really the same at all as Iowa Poetry Association and Lyrical Iowa, which is what makes it a nice synergy. It's related, but not in anywhere near really the same. So I don't know if that helps answer a question there. So if anybody's got any questions, this is the last lingering few seconds for those. And thank you all for being here and sharing time. And feel free to contact each other and me or the other presenters as much as you like. So, well, and next week, of course, it's going to be Barbara featuring Daughters of Revolution. So that'll be exciting. So we'll see what that sparks. So I think I'm going to sign us off here. We've kind of overstayed our welcome, but they don't mind. So take care, everybody. Have a great week.